Having just finished filming A Hard Day's Night and most of the albums, the Beatles pretty much took off the entire month of May. We're going to talk about that month now, and we're going to break it up into two parts, and this one's going to be about John and George and their vacation. Brian treated their privacy and security with the utmost importance. They were trying to plan exactly what they were going to do for this holiday. It had to be big, it had to be extravagant, and it had to be private, and it had to be secret, because the Beatles couldn't even breathe without the press getting wind of it. So it says online that he hired a company to arrange a foolproof secret route to two different destinations. One for half the Beatles and their significant others, and the other destination for the other half. I also have read that Derek Taylor was the one that came up with everything, so that's not really another company. That's Derek Taylor, who now works for Brian Epstein as his personal assistant, so I'm not sure what the truth is. But in any case, none of the arrangements could be made by phone. Like, this was like top secret. So I imagine someone like went to a travel agent and tried to get everything set up and organized with everything without calling around and doing everything. And in order for this to even happen, because at some point the phone had to be picked up, everyone had an alias. I'm not sure. I think Derek Taylor came up with all of the aliases for everyone. And so John Lennon was Mr. Leslie, and Cynthia was Miss Leslie, Mrs. Leslie. George Harrison was Mr. Hargreaves, and Pattie Boyd was Miss Bond. Paul McCartney was Mr. Manning, and Jane Asher was Miss Ashcroft. As you'll notice, these names match their surname a little bit, and I imagine that's to actually keep things straight. So when they say, oh, Manning is supposed to be here and Ashcroft is supposed, they know, okay, Ashcroft, that's Asher, etc. Ringo Starr was Mr. Stone, and Maureen Cox was Miss Cockcroft.
I can't do it.
Neil Aspinall was Mr. Ashenden, and Derek Taylor was Mr. Tatlock. On top of this, they also had disguises, wigs. For the most part, it was a success. Their location did get leaked a few times, but in terms of just all the logistics, there was only one screw up, and it was a pretty major one. Ringo's passport had been swapped with George's passport. So as Ringo's going through on his airport, he has George Harrison's passport and George has his. And since they were going to different locations, Ringo was going one place, George was going to another, that was an issue. They couldn't just say, oh, here, we'll just swap them. They had to somehow get it across the world somehow. So fortunately, there was enough planes going back and forth through this whole entire thing because they went a far way away. And so they were able to deliver the passports at the next destination they were going to be, and everything got sorted. Not sure how they got out of Britain without a passport, but I suppose that's how it goes, right? You can get out of your country, but you just can't get into the next one. So anyway, they got it all sorted out. We are going to be talking about John and Cynthia, George and Pattie's vacation to Tahiti, which is in the Oceania part of the world. And they started their trip May 2nd, 1964. That's the time period that we're talking about. All of May, pretty much. Their secret route was a private plane to Amsterdam. Then they flew to Edmonton, Alberta, and then Honolulu. Well, unfortunately, they got off their plane in Edmonton, although I've also read it's Vancouver. Once again, who knows? I'm sure there's an exact version and the internet's just confused, and that was my bad. I should have done better research. But for 20 minutes while they were refueling, they got out someplace in Canada. And this was enough to alert the entire American disc jockey network of their arrival in Honolulu. So wherever they were seen. There's the Beatles. They're on that plane. Instantly, the reporters figured out where that plane was headed. They knew that their next stop was Honolulu. They didn't know what they were going to go after that, but they knew Honolulu. So they did have to stay for 2 days in Honolulu to wait for a flight that went to Tahiti. And most of the time they were completely hounded by the press because everyone flew to Honolulu to just get access to the Beatles at that time. Actually insane. They decided to head up to the north side of Oahu, where they were staying, and they found that a lot of people didn't really know them there. Maybe outside of the touristy areas, you just have normal people living in Hawaii, and they had relative anonymity during that time while they were waiting for their flight. And anyway, they flew to Tahiti after that. After they arrived, they went shopping. It was like the first thing that they did. And John and George bought dark green oilskin coats, like big trench coat things, raincoats. They chartered a sailboat. The three-masted Malus is the name of the boat, I found out, which they went to and slept on that night. The next day, they sailed out of the harbor, but hit a rough patch in the weather. So unable to go below the deck. So basically they were saying that on that ship, the Malus, they had just painted the cabin, and obviously there's gas for the fuel. So down below deck, it smelled so much of paint and gasoline that they couldn't go and stay there. It was just too maybe not toxic, but too intense for them to go spend time there. So they had to stay on the deck while the boat is tossing and turning in this rough patch of weather. And John and Cynthia puked over the side of the boat. Eventually, at the end of the day, they anchored at one of the next islands. They went and jumped from a bunch of different islands. They just crashed in their bunks and were worn out from that whole terrible day at sea. I've also read that there was actually a couple of days of bad weather. Anyway, the next day, they woke up refreshed and impressed by the tropical milieu, and having, rarely left the UK, seeing a tropical Tahiti paradise was crazy to them, especially since UK is known for having very cloudy, rainy weather a lot of the time. They snorkeled, they swam, they sailed around to various islands. John specifically lists out some of these islands as Moorea, Raiatea, Tahaha, Bora Bora, and Huahine. Although he mentions this in the Beatles book, like the fan magazine, and he gets every name wrong. And at the end says, go look it up. So I did have to look it up. George spent a lot of time fishing off the side of the boat. He fancied himself a great fisherman, although John mentions that he was just pulling up little tiddlers. John showed him up, of course, as he always needs to do, and he caught an octopus. George said, and then this Tahitian bloke put it in a bucket with a lot of other fish, and those fish started eating its legs. Very strange. Anyway, George did eventually catch a fish that had sharp fins. He was throwing the fish and ended up cutting his thumb open. He said he should have had stitches, but there were no hospitals around, so the local wallas split a lime and squeezed the juice onto the wound to clean it, to sterilize it. The crew didn't know who they were and never ran into any press there in Tahiti or in the surrounding islands. It was great, which is not the story that Paul and Ringo have, so at least John and George had some anonymity. At one point, an Australian found them, I will say, and swam with them. He asked if he could come on their boat, but they said no, so the poor guy had to swim a long way back to his own boat. But it was one of those things where I think he saw them on his boat, and he jumped off his boat and swam over. It's like, hi, the Beatles, can we hang out? And they're like, no. He's like, okay, and he went back. John had started to write his next book, A Spaniard, in the works. And on the boat, he had found a Sherlock Holmes anthology by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He'd read a few Sherlock Holmes books as a kid, but he decided to pick this up out of boredom. For him, you could only take too much tropical paradise. He needed some intellectual stimulation, so he read the entire anthology. And basically, it seems like the anthology contained all the Holmes' stories in a single volume. And when he read them one after another, he realized that they were all essentially the exact same story, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone. But anyway, because of this, he decided to write this singular same story. So he's like, I could write that one story, but the perfect version of that one story. So he went to go write that. Specifically, he was working on the piece from the book that was eventually titled The Singularge Experience of Miss Anne Duffield, if you want to read that. He wanted to make an entire book of just that story, but he couldn't. He just gave up halfway through. But I will say that the main character in that was called Shamrock Wolms. Everyone was contributing like phrases and funny things to it, or just the book in general. So there's a couple of accounts where they were sitting around eating, and every time someone said something funny or weird, they were all jotting down the phrases that he could use in the book. Now to get to the problematic part of the story, there's always one, it seems. They filmed a short film on 8mm there, and I actually think that this is shown in various places, if not in the anthology, on some documentaries or some montages. So I'm sure people have seen it, but probably not all the problematic parts. But John wearing 5 pairs of glasses at once, which there's plenty of pictures of that, I suppose. George was wearing Cynthia and Pattie's wigs, and they were both wearing those oilskin coats to play natives that were living on an island. And then John played a preacher that came to the island to convert them to Christianity. So that's the general story that you get. Once again, I read the Beatles book, and it has more details, which I was like, you probably shouldn't put that out there. But anyway, this is what they said. George said, "We decided later to take it a stage further. On the shore, we saw these native blokes, all strange-looking characters with no teeth, or just teeth that were moldy. They were hanging about, waiting to catch the tourist with all the junk they'd made laid out near them. Well, they seemed ideal for us to have a go at." John said, "So we rushed ashore, looking like madmen, picking up the natives' bits and pieces and chucking them into a bag. They looked pretty mad, but we looked even madder." And then George says, "We discovered that all those wonderful native girls that you read so much about had no teeth because the Americans went down there with their chewing gum during the war with Japan." So anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. They were fish out of water. Anyway, that is all the details I had gathered from their vacation for that month. So they traveled home on May 26th. So May 2nd to May 26th. And they traveled to New Zealand and then to Los Angeles, where they had a plane, just the 4 of them. And John took that opportunity to sleep in the aisle of the plane. In Los Angeles, the Pan Am provided a bus tour to see celebrities' houses around Beverly Hills. So they did that whole touristy thing. Like, oh, there's Greta Garbo's place, whatever. And then finally, they flew back to London. When he got back, John said he didn't like the vacation all that much. He mentioned that it was fantastic, but that they just wasted time sitting on the beach. When they got back to London, it was business as usual. And it made sense because, about a week later, they went on tour in Australia and New Zealand. So it's like they went all the way down to that part of the world, came all the way back, and then went right back to Australia. So it was quite crazy, the travel, and John's very meta about everything. He's like, yeah, it's all the same. So next week, we'll continue with Paul and Ringo's story.